Out of respect for you who joined us on time, we'll start on time. So thank you again for joining. My name is Aaron Petrillo, and I'm from ONMAR, one of the organizations that helps support the Department of Education's Personnel Development Program data collection system. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that we'll be recording today's session and it'll be available on the website. And certainly if you have questions throughout the meeting or session rather, please drop any questions that you have in the chat box on the right-hand side, and we'll try to answer them as we go. And if it's specific to your individual grant, still feel free to include it in the chat if you wish. However, we'll try to address those questions after the session itself. So we encourage you to also direct those to our help desk as well to answer grant-specific questions. So again, my name is Aaron Petrillo. I'll be joined by my colleagues, Michelle Bloom and Mariel McKinnon. All of us are part of the Personnel Development Data Collection System support team, as well as folks from the Department of Education themselves. Dr. Allen and Rochelle Davis are also here to help us along today. So during today's session, we'll review the PDPDCS scholar agreements and make sure for those of you who haven't interacted with the system in a while or are new, even though you're part of an old grant, a continuing grant, and maybe a new project director. So we'll review the scholar agreements as we have in the past, just as a refresher. Then we'll talk through the different required actions within data submission, also how to protect your data and your scholars' data, rather, and avoid accidentally exposing the personally identifiable information. And then we'll wrap up by briefly talking through past changes to the PDPDCS, likely that you haven't seen since you've logged in, but also those that will be coming up in this year. And then also additional resources for you as well as your colleagues at the universities and your scholars too. So to start, I'll talk through the scholar agreements. So as we've discussed in the past, grantees, as grantees, you're required to complete 2 agreements with your scholar. The first being pre-scholarship agreement and within 30 days of when they enroll, and then an exit certification after they have exited the program. You must use the required forms that are available on the PDPDCS site, available on the link below, and we'll drop all of these links in the chat box as well throughout the session. But both agreements are required for every scholar, and they must all of the pages must be included and signed. I know that's a basic instruction, but it's definitely something that we've encountered issues with grants in the past submitting them to the PDPDCS. Other important areas to pay attention to, in particular within the exit certification, there are 3 items that we really encourage you to pay particular attention to. First, the accumulated academic years of funding. Second, the total service obligation in months that then would be calculated by taking those academic years of funding and multiplying them by 2, so or the number of years supported over academic years of funding, double that for service obligation, and then converting it into months. So if someone is funded for a year, they would owe 24 months of service obligation. And then the 5th item in particular to pay attention to is the total amount of funding the scholar has received for the OSEP supported training. We also encourage you, these items also are required for you to input them into the scholar agreement within the PDPDCS system. So you should, before submitting and uploading this exit certification, double check to make sure that these numbers match that which is in the system. In addition, as you know, there's a lot of scholar information contained on these scholar agreements. In particular, the grantee or the scholar's Social Security number is of particular importance to ensure that it is actually redacted before uploading it into the PDPDCS system. We do that in order to avoid, if there are any security incidents where the site itself is compromised. While you input the scholar's Social Security number directly into the system, we're able to encrypt that data, whereas if you include their social in a PDF that you upload, it's far harder for us to protect the grantee if the security of the website is compromised, as well as during the submission process itself. So we strongly encourage you to take particular steps to ensure that grantees, or that you as a grantee redact all of your scholar's Social Security number and in their agreements. If you do not follow these processes by either not using the correct agreements or including incorrect information within the agreements, you as the grantee could be responsible for the repayment of that scholar's funds if, for instance, they do not have a signed or valid agreement uploaded into the system and available. And just a reminder for both agreements, for the pre-scholarship agreement or the PSA, you as the grantee and the scholar must, you as a grantee will complete it and the scholar must sign it within 30 days of the scholar's enrollment. And then on the flip side, for exit certification, scholars who have exited, you as the grantee must complete the exit certification and scholars must sign and have it uploaded into the PDPDCS within 30 days of their exit. So that could be either they drop out or if they've graduated or if your grant has ended and their funding has ended, but they are still actually enrolled. These are all scenarios in which an exit certification will be required to be submitted in the PDPDCS. And then just to emphasize again, it's extremely important for you to use the correct version of the scholar agreement. And again, in the chat box, we've provided a link for you to do so. Ensure that all the pages of that PDF are included and everything is written and legible, and the Social Security numbers are redacted. Again, if for some reason a scholar does not have a valid signed agreement uploaded into the PDPDCS, it may result in you as the grantee becoming responsible for repaying that scholar's funds if something were to happen, and it would be required to do so. Okay. And again, as we go through, please feel free to include questions in the chat box on the right-hand side. So some reminders that we encourage you as grantees to provide to your scholars. Number one, especially before enrolling and accepting funding, emphasize the importance that they emphasize that if they exit prior to one academic year of enrollment, it requires that they repay their service obligation by cash payment only. They will not have the ability to fulfill their obligation through service. So if they do not complete one academic year, they immediately are reverted to cash payback to pay back their scholarship. In addition, conversely, once they do complete that one academic year, scholars are able to begin fulfilling their obligation through eligible employment and service. So even though a scholar may be enrolled in a multi-year program, once they complete that one academic year and they are enrolled or employed in an eligible position, they may begin using that eligible employment to fulfill their obligation. And then lastly, one of the reminders that we on this page really want to emphasize is encouraging your scholars to access the PDPDCS regularly. So to update their employment at least every 6 months, to ensure that they have accurate counts within the system of how much service obligation they have remaining, but as well as those who are enrolled for them to continually access the site, ensure their contact information is correct, as well as the information related to their academic years and total amount of funding within the system. While you certainly as grantees access the system regularly, at least once a year, we also encourage you to do it every 6 months or so. We certainly find that scholars, particularly those that are enrolled, log in far less frequently. So we definitely encourage you as grantees to try to encourage your scholars to do so more regularly. Some additional reminders for you to provide to scholars. Again, they are responsible for ensuring their submitted employment is reviewed and verified by their employer. This often happens with grantees or scholars rather who submit employment for verification and then don't check back to see if it in fact has been verified. And while we are working to improve the reminders and communication to employers, ultimately it comes down to the scholar as the responsible party for their employment to be verified. And then in addition, ultimately, it's important to remind scholars that if they don't have their employment verified and or if they don't fulfill their service obligation within the required period, including their grace period, they will be referred to the ARBMD group, the financial group within the U.S. Department of Education, ultimately to pay back their scholarship using cash payback. So how does OSEP use data that grantees report? As we've discussed in the past, the PDPDCS is critical for many data uses within the department. One certainly is to ensure that scholars' service obligation requirements are fulfilled, and also for us to use that data to refer scholars who did not comply with their service obligation requirements, referring them to ARBMD, that financial group within the Department of Ed, to collect their scholarship. But also, in addition to that, we use OSEP uses data to understand program performance and the progress that you as grantees have made, but then also to inform other internal program, not just individual grantee performance, but also program-wide initiatives and improvements as well. So using data from the PDPDCS to improve and target different funding areas in future competitions, improve the way that OSEP monitors and provides technical assistance to grantees. It's vitally important for this data to be accurate and on time for us to be able to meet those additional data needs as well. And then finally, as the last slide within this section, we want to emphasize the importance of logging into the system and updating your scholar records. So as we've discussed previously, the data collection period, we require that you as a grantee between now, the beginning of February, and April 3rd, go in and update the status for all of your grants, all of your scholars, and to update their status within the system, whether they have exited, they're still enrolled. We still require you to go in and confirm and update the status within your grant. And in addition to that, we again encourage you to update your scholar's information throughout the year. However, within this time period, by April 3rd, we ask that you go into the PDPDCS and ensure all the information for scholars has been updated. Looking at a few questions on the right-hand side, determination of one academic year, yes, is defined by each institution. So certainly, if you define it as a fall and spring semester, that is certainly what you would use. Let's see. Yes, so we do have a question regarding Adobe Signature for Scholar agreements. We actually are working on a new enhancement that we'll talk about a little later to improve your access and the data burden on reduce the data burden on you, the grantees, to populate Scholar agreements and Scholar records by allowing you to populate them at a single time within the system that would populate both your Scholar record and your agreements. We'll talk about those in a moment. Another question, how do you handle a Scholar that refuses to make him or herself available to sign their exit certification? If you encounter that scenario, I would strongly encourage you to contact the help desk, and we'll work with you to better understand that individual situation and give you guidance as to how best to address the situation. So, okay. With that, I will hand over the ball in presentation to, sorry, is it Michelle or Mariel? I can't remember.
Michelle.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right, off to you, Michelle.
All right, thank you, Aaron, and thank you everyone who's joining us today. Today I'm going to talk about the actions you need to complete in the PDPDCS for this data collection period. In this section, I'll explain each of the tasks that grantees should complete for all enrolled scholars in your active grants. So you need to log into the PDPDCS and verify your secondary user if you have one, review your data summary, add any new scholars that may have enrolled, update several sections in the Scholar record, enter any exit information for scholars who are no longer enrolled, and make sure that you review and submit all your data by April 3rd. The first step is to log in and review your grants users. You may want to set up a secondary user if you want someone else within your grant to be able to enter Scholar information. However, remember the project director is ultimately held responsible for all data entries. Each person should have a unique login to the system. Do not share your password with anyone. Add a secondary user instead. PDPDCS is governed by federal security regulations, and sharing your password violates those security regulations. Note that only 2 people per grant are permitted access. To add a secondary user, click on your grant number. In the screenshot on the screen, you can see it's test K110508. So you will click that, and then under the drop-down menu for select a secondary user that comes up, you will click on the person you want to designate as the secondary user. You may need to create a profile for a new user if they are not already in the system. To do this, you'll click on the link that says click here to add more personnel to dropdown, then fill out the information and submit the form. Then you will go back to this page that you see or just hit refresh, and the new user will be listed in the drop-down menu. Make sure to submit the record at the bottom of this page, and you will now have a secondary user. At the bottom of your grant page after you log in, you will see the report shown in this screenshot. It displays counts of all scholar statuses and service obligation statuses, so you can easily see what stage of the process your scholars are in at any time. You can see which scholars are still in a pending status. After April 3rd, at the end of the data collection period, that number should be 0. Also remind scholars to log in at least every 6 months to review and update contact and training information and enter employment. Your support will help us ensure OSEP has the data it needs to provide reporting on program performance measures and service obligation results to federal government authorities. You should add new scholar records for scholars who are not already in the system who have been enrolled in the program for 30 days or more. Use the Add New Scholar Record button to add any new scholars. On the next page, you will see a scholar social security number. You will use a scholar's social security number to check if the scholar is already in the system. You can also click on View All Scholar Records to see each scholar's program completion and service obligation statuses on the next page. In step 4, you will update items 5 and 6. In section G, these items need to be completed for each grant budget period or fiscal year that the scholar is enrolled in the program. The budget period in these items refers to your grant's fiscal year, which is not necessarily the academic year. For example, if your grant budget period runs from January to December, then you should complete these items based on January 1st, 2018 to December 31st, 2018. You can find your grant fiscal year in the PDPDCS, and the dates of your grant's fiscal year were included in a notification email you received this month. If you have any questions about your grant's budget period, please contact the help desk. Section H, information about the scholar's employment during the grant budget year, also needs to be completed for each grant budget period or fiscal year that the scholar is enrolled in the program. If scholars are still enrolled, you need to update their accumulated academic years of funding in number 3 of section I. Once a scholar has completed one academic year, make sure to indicate that and enter the date in number 2. This is very important because scholars are not able to enter employment information for service obligation fulfillment until they have completed one academic year. If you, as the grantee, do not indicate this date on the PDPDCS, the scholar will not be able to submit an employment record. When a scholar exits the program, the grantee must enter the date of exit and upload the completed and signed exit certification. For scholars that complete the program, grantees will enter the degree earned and the area of the degree. This is particularly important for grants that are closed. If a grant has closed, all scholars must be in an exited, graduated, or exit prior to completion status. I'll repeat that one more time. If a grant has closed, all scholars must be in an exited / graduated or exited prior to completion status. If you choose to mark a scholar as exited prior to completion, you will have the option to note that they were exited because the grant has closed. If you indicate that the scholar completed the program, then in the next section, you will choose the degree or certificate that the scholar received, as well as the special education and related service area. The priority under which you were funded requires grantees to identify a measure of knowledge and skill attainment in the grant application. OSEP expects that all project directors will have identified at least one measure of skills and knowledge as part of program completion requirements for scholars. The data collected in this section is used for program performance measures, so it is critical that you obtain complete information from your scholars about measures of skill and knowledge. This includes what the measure is and whether or not the scholar passed the measure. Notify scholars at the beginning of the program that they will be asked to provide licensure test results or other exams as required under your priority, and the results will be reported in your data collection. Remember, the quality of grantee data influences annual results on program performance measures. There are a few important things to remember in regards to the measures of skills and knowledge. 1, grantees should note that comprehensive exams, portfolios, practicums, defensive dissertations, thesis, and supervisor evaluations are acceptable and are considered grantee-specific measures. In some states, certification or licensure requirements necessitate that scholars take some standardized measures, and grantees can use these measures in their reporting. It is not a requirement if you have another measure. We continue to have some grantees reporting that some measures should not be included. Because we are looking for a measure that is taken towards the end of the scholar's experience in your program, entrance and preliminary exams are not acceptable. Individual course exams and grades are also not considered to be cumulative enough as a measure. I see the question about a postdoc scholar. That is a separate category, and if that is the case, you will email the help desk and we will take note of that when going through the data on the measures of skills and knowledge. Make sure by the deadline of April 3rd, 2020, you enter and update and submit records for all currently enrolled scholars and scholars who have graduated or exited prior to completion since your last update to the system. You do not need to update records for scholars you have already submitted as graduated or exited prior to completion. In fact, once you have submitted a record for a scholar with one of these statuses, you will not be able to edit the record. If you need to make any changes to records for scholars who have already exited, please contact the help desk. Make sure that you have no scholars in a pending status by the deadline of April 3rd. Scholars cannot be left in a pending status for more than 30 days. All non-compliant grantees will be reported to OSEP. Project officers will be contacting each project director of grants that have not submitted all scholar data to determine what barriers are preventing the grantee from submitting their scholar data as required and in a timely manner. Remember that the Secretary can consider failure to submit scholar data in a timely fashion in determining your project's ability to obtain future grants from OSEP or under any other department program. If you have any questions about submitting data or using the PDPDCS, you can always contact the help desk. All right. See if there's any more questions. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Marielle.
Hello, this is Marielle, and I'll be going over the PDPDCS data submission FAQs. Okay, so as continuing grantees, many of you have or should have already accessed the site at one point, and we get the question, how do you reset your password? So if you don't remember your password, on the login screen, once you access the website, you can click the Forgot Password link, and this will generate an email with instructions for resetting your password. And if you've done this function and you don't see your email in your inbox, please check your spam or junk folder. How often should I be logging into the PDPDCS? And I know Erin covered this as well. So as a reminder, grantees must update information in the PDPDCS for all scholars within 30 days of enrolling a new scholar. And when there is a change in the scholar's status, also by the end of your grant's fiscal year. So those are three of the main times that you want to make sure you're going in to update information. And many grantees may wonder, why aren't I or my scholars receiving emails from the PDPDCS? So to ensure that your scholars and you are receiving all system notifications, we ask that you add our email address, service obligation at ed.gov, to your contact list, or your safe, we can call it a safe senders list. And we ask that you check your email settings to be sure that emails from this account are not marked as spam, and that also addresses the previous slide about getting your password reset email. So this would help prevent those from going into your spam or junk folder. And also, by entering a non-IHE email address for each scholar, we definitely encourage you to use personal email addresses, especially because the scholars are going to be needing to log in after graduation or exit from the program. Why should I add a secondary user? Project directors are strongly recommended to add a secondary user to assist with the data entry. We know that you're handling a lot of information, and a trusted secondary user can definitely ease some of that burden. And there are a few things that we want you to note when adding a secondary user. So Project directors are ultimately responsible for all data entries. For example, if there's incorrect information or missing data, you will be contacted, and I think Erin went over that as well. Only 2 people per grant are permitted access, and that does include you. So it's the project director's account as well as one selected secondary user's account, and this is per grant. Also, that secondary users are given a unique login, so we definitely don't want you to share any of your login information. Once you add the secondary user, they will receive instructions on how to log in and be able to create a password for themselves. And secondary users will also be receiving the PDPDCS reminder emails and notifications as well. How do I know if my scholars have logged into the PDPDCS? So we ask that you remind scholars to log into the DCS at least every 6 months to review and update their information. And this is even while they're still enrolled and not yet entering employment information. We want to make sure that the scholars are getting used to accessing their accounts, because they will be required to access their accounts to enter and update their employment information once they're eligible to do so. So we definitely encouraging the scholars to log in, because they do get that access, that welcome email right when you're creating a record for them. And you should monitor the service obligation status of all scholars in your program using the summary tables that display counts of scholars in each status. And you can see that when you first log into your account. And if you manage multiple grants, as you can see on the slide here in the gray bar, that's where your grant number is. So just make sure you're looking at the right grant number to get kind of this summary overview. And as you can see, here's an example, the awaiting login and the fulfillment not in progress. So this just gives you a snapshot of how many scholars are in each of these statuses. And your support in this area will help us ensure that OSEP has the data it needs to provide reporting on program performance measures and service obligation results to federal government authorities. My scholar is still enrolled. Should I submit his or her record? So we get a lot of questions on this, and yes, we do want you to submit all scholar records. So even when you're going in and updating records for scholars that have already, that already have a record in there that have already been created initially, you will need to press the Save and Submit button, and you will still be able to edit your scholar records as long as the scholar has a program status of enrolled. So a lot of times grantees may get confused and think, oh, if I press Save and Submit, I will no longer be able to check it and make any edits, and that is not true as long as the scholar remains in an enrollment status. Now, once you indicate that the scholar has either exited prior to completion or has graduated and completed the program, and then you press Save and Submit, that does in fact disable that particular record with that status from edits. And if you do have this issue, you can definitely give the help desk a call or send us an email, and we can assist you to reverse that if you made this mistake. What is a no-cost extension? So grantees can request a one-time no-cost extension to allow for more time for scholars to complete the preparation program. Now, we ask that you manage the grant so that all scholars complete the program before the grant ends. However, OSEP does allow all grantees to exercise a one-time no-cost extension to allow more time, which usually is up to 12 months, and no new money would be awarded. And this is for the scholars to complete the preparation program and graduate. We want all scholars to complete the program and be counted as program completers. And OSEP will consider, with adequate justification, a request for a second no-cost extension, and this can also offer some scholars additional time if that's needed to complete their degree program and graduate before the grant officially ends. If more time with no new money, it's also more time with no new money, and it will allow more scholars to be considered completers. So if that's something that is needed, you would please talk to your OSEP project officer. In general, we definitely want to support those requests whenever we can. And when a scholar, for unexpected circumstance, which may happen sometimes, is unable to, for example, finish their program despite your adequate planning, the project officer may permit that the scholar transfers to another OSEP-funded program. That's if it's a comparable program and it's available at the institution. But this requires approval from your OSEP project officer, and close coordination is definitely required to assure that all service obligation requirements are met to avoid the scholar from having to enter into cash repayment. And that concludes this section of the webinar. Do we have any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions. Let me go ahead and hand it over. And it's going to you, Erin, correct?
Actually, it should come to Rochelle.
Oh, okay, Rochelle.
Thank you, Mariel. With this section right here, we are going to be talking about some of the security incidents that occur within PDPDCS and how you can help us to avoid those incidents. So, the biggest security incident that we have is the exposure of scholar PII. And generally, this happens if personally identifiable information is viewed or is viewable to an unrelated party. In the PDPDCS, we have two primary examples where this happens. The first is when we have an unredacted pre-scholarship agreement that is uploaded to the wrong scholar file. And then the second one is when we have unencrypted personally identifiable information, typically in a PSA, that's emailed to the PDPDCS help desk or anybody associated with the PDPDCS. And so those are two of the primary examples that we have and that we want to make sure that we avoid. And so these have quite a bit of impact on both OSEP and the Department of Education as well as the PDPDCS. For every security incident that happens, we have to go through a series of steps. The first being that PDPDCS notifies the Department of Education's Security Operations Center. Once they do that, they have to use a particular document to document the incident, and then they have to make sure that they have expunged the file or the email from the PDPDCS or any email servers. Once that's completed, additional interviews, investigations, and mitigation strategies might have to be undertaken if an unauthorized individual viewed this information. Once that's completed, the PDPDCS staff goes through all other scholar records and documentation associated with the grantee to ensure that security incidents have not occurred. So as you can see, a great deal of time and attention has to be put forth if we have a security incident. So we want to make sure that we avoid those. But the department and PDPDCS is not the only group that's impacted. Grantees and project directors are also impacted because grantees are going to need to resubmit scholar documentation and also complete security incident reports. Project directors and secondary users are going to be required to participate in security training to make sure that they understand how to properly handle scholar PII and what happens if we do have a data breach. And then finally, the grant could be placed on a security incident list that is tracked by both PDPDCS and OSEP. And this is very important. If further incidents occur, the grant and university could be placed on a high-risk status, impacting their ability to receive future federal funding. So some of the ways that we can avoid these security incidents, make sure that you develop some sort of upload checklist so that you can review the scholar agreement, make sure that you have the correct name, make sure that the social security number is redacted, and then make sure that the file name is correct. We suggest implementing a file naming convention to avoid uploading the wrong file to the wrong scholar's record. An example that we give you on this is PSA_J_DOE.pdf. And then always make sure that you encrypt any file that you send by email, including to the PDPDCS help desk. And we should have added encrypt files that contain PII. And then review all files after uploading them to PDPDCS to ensure that the agreements have been uploaded and they've been uploaded to the correct scholar with redacted information. At this point in time, I'm going to pass it over to Aaron, and he's going to take us through some of the recent changes.
Great. Thanks, Rochelle. Yes, so we wanted to just talk through some recent changes to the PDPDCS that you hopefully will be have experienced or will be experiencing as you update all of your scholar statuses between now and April 3rd. The first or the most significant is using multi-factor authentication. You as grantees, and then certainly your scholars, eventually will have to use multi-factor authentication. You probably have used this previously with logging into your bank or potentially some of your university accounts, but it requires you to use not only your username and password on the PDPDCS, but also use a secondary factor to validate your identity. And so in this case, we use an app, a phone app called Google Authenticator. And you download Google Authenticator as an app, and the system, the first time you use it, will prompt you to scan a barcode or QR code on the site using the app, which will then automatically sync your phone to your account. And then moving forward, what it will do is give you a 6-digit code that after you enter your username and password, it'll prompt you for that code. Once you enter it, you'll have the same access that you normally would have. Again, this is really intended on improving the security measures that we, the department, and support staff employ to protect users accessing the system. And so unless you don't have the ability or access to a smartphone, you will be required to use this as you move forward. In addition, as I mentioned, your scholars will also be required to do so. We have a number of resources related to MFA on the website, and in everything from tutorial on how to PowerPoint presentation on how to use it to walk through each individual step, as well as links to access the either iTunes Store or Google Play Store or other to download the app itself. As always, if you have questions related to MFA, system access, or anything related to the PDPDCS, we strongly encourage you to contact our help desk, which is always available Monday, Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., and we try to respond to inquiries within 1 business day. Typically at the beginning of data collection and at the end, we have a lot of responses, so we may be a little delayed, but we always try to respond typically within a full business day. As I mentioned earlier, one big change that will be occurring later this year will be the implementation of digital scholar agreements. So as I mentioned earlier, right now you're required to download a PDF, complete it, have your scholar sign, and then redact and upload. In addition to doing that, you need to pay attention to those 3 data elements that we mentioned earlier: total academic years of funding, excuse me, the total amount funded, as well as the service obligation that's required. Then you have to compare that to the scholar record in the PDPDCS to ensure those numbers match. Obviously, that introduces a number of data quality issues and potential confusion because you have to compare across documents. So one of the benefits that we're going to see once digital scholar agreements are implemented is that, number one, we're reducing that data burden, so you're only having to enter into the system 1 time for the number of academic years funded. It'll automatically calculate the service obligation, and then you input the total amount of funding received. And then the system will use that information for both the scholar agreement as well as the scholar record itself. So we ensure alignment of that data across the two. In addition, this would eliminate the need for you to upload documents that would potentially contain personally identifiable information. As Rochelle mentioned earlier, that's a a major focus of ours throughout this year is to reduce those security incidents. And excuse me. So one of the benefits of this as well is that while you enter the social security number of your scholars into the system now, you won't have to upload documentation that also potentially could include that unredacted social security number. You'll be able to download the scholar agreement into a PDF. It'll be automatically redacted, and you'll have it available for your records, but you will be able to use this enhancement to digitally sign the agreements for you and your scholar, as well as facilitate a workflow process for your scholar to provide feedback or questions within the agreement itself. That way you may not necessarily have to sit down with your scholar and go through each bullet point, though we strongly encourage you to do so. If they do have questions just before they sign, they can communicate that through the PDPDCS. Again, this will be coming to you all later in 2020. We'll provide plenty of notice as well as resources and how to manage this transition as we go later into the year. I should also mention there may be other potential changes related to the site that would occur later in the year. Any changes that occur, either the required data or the system itself, will communicate that to you and your scholars with plenty of notice before the requirements are implemented. And digital scholar agreements are certainly one of those. So as I mentioned, we have a number of resources and supports available to you as grantees, as well as scholars and their employers. The first that we strongly encourage you as project directors to review, if you have not already, are the frequently asked questions that we have available. We have frequently asked questions related to the programs, regulations and requirements in the statutes themselves, as well as information related to the PDPDCS and frequently asked questions related to the information system and your process for submitting data. So we have a wealth of information on the site there. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, on the trainings page, we not only have resources related to multi-factor authentication or MFA, but we also have recordings of this and previous webinars, the PowerPoints for them as well, which this will be uploaded in the coming days. We have a number of resources for scholars, including a scholar quick reference guide, as well as a tip sheet that scholars can use to send to their employers to help them better understand what the system is or what the program is about, the requirements that their employee or the scholar have to fulfill eligible employment, and how they can verify their employment. So we strongly encourage you to visit the training pages and either to use the resources yourselves or to communicate and distribute them to your scholars. I would, in particular, for those scholars that are completing one academic year and or graduating and completing the program, giving them the tip sheet for employers would be definitely a helpful resource to provide to them to then in turn provide to their employers. And again, we have the link in the chat box on the right-hand side. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, the required scholar agreements are available on the PDPDCS website as well, using the link included here. And then, as I mentioned, we have a wealth of knowledge related to the program regulations, including the actual regulations themselves, as well as frequently asked questions for you and your colleagues and scholars as well. And then the last and most significant resource, as we've mentioned throughout, certainly is the PDPDCS help desk themselves. So as we enter the data collection period, which starts today and ends on April 3rd, we certainly begin to see a surge of questions from you grantees and scholars. And we are available every day, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. By either phone or email. If you have questions that are related to your specific grant, please make sure to include your grant number. That way we can provide you with as much specific information as possible. And certainly during the data collection period, we ask for your patience, as many of you and your colleagues are sending questions our way. We try to respond within 1 business day, but sometimes, particularly as we get closer to the April 3rd deadline, our ability to respond is limited just due to the volume. As we've said previously, you must go into the PDPDCS and update the status of all of your scholars prior to April 3rd. We will be sending out reminders to you, and particularly grants that have scholars in a pending status prior to the April 3rd deadline. But as I said, in particular, if you encounter instances in which you need help, we strongly encourage you to do so sooner in the data collection period than later. That way we can more quickly address any concerns or issues that you're encountering. So let's see. So with that, we are at the end of our session today. We'll certainly be around to answer questions within the chat. I'm just looking at questions in here. Can you clarify exit status for scholars who complete all coursework during the funding period yet are essentially ABD at the end? Katie, I would encourage you to email the help desk so we can better understand the specific requirements of the grant program that you're enrolled in or that you proposed, and that way we can better determine what status your scholars may need to be placed within if they are in an all but dissertation status at the end of funding period. But typically if a scholar has not completed, are still enrolled but are no longer receiving funding, either because you, the grantee, don't have funds for them that semester, or they're continuing on with the program beyond the planned funding period, you can then put them into a status of enrolled but not receiving funding. But Katie, I would encourage you to contact the help desk for us to better understand specifically for your individual grant. So for those of you who are who have additional questions, please include them in the chat box on the right-hand side. If not, we strongly encourage you to provide feedback on today's session by visiting the link that we have on the slide here today. In particular, we ask you to provide feedback on what resources and or training materials would be helpful for you as well as your scholars. We strongly encourage you to provide feedback where you can, particularly because you know, it's hard for us to always anticipate the different needs that you as grantees have, and so having any insight on the different resources that would be helpful for you would be fantastic. So I strongly encourage you to visit the link, and if you have any additional questions, we'll stay on for a little longer, so you're more than welcome to drop them in the chat box on the right-hand side. So thank you all very much for joining today. Today's webinar will be posted on the training webpage. It will take a few days for us to get the closed captioning applied to the video, but that will be up as well as the actual PowerPoint itself, which will be available on the training webpage. And we'll also try to send that out as a follow-up to the invitation that we sent out today. So, thank you all very much.